Okay, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you happen to be joining us from, anywhere in the world. A very warm welcome. My name is John Gazvinian. I'm Executive Director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this second in the series on social change and the global Middle East, which we are honored to be a series that we were honored to be presenting this year in partnership with the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. At the Middle East, at the University of Pennsylvania. And on that note, I want to thank very warmly our co-sponsors, the director and associate director, respectively, of the Mitchell Center, Jeff Green and Matt Roth, for all their hard work in putting all of this together. We kicked off this year of programming with a fantastic keynote address from the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Tawakkol Karaman. And then last month, we had the pleasure of a conversation with about governance with about social movements in the Middle East with Rashid Khalidi and Joel Bainan, and that was an absolutely fantastic conversation. And we are confident that today's will be even more exciting. We have today with us two absolutely outstanding scholars, writers, practitioners, neither of whom needs any introduction, which is why I will not be making the introduction. The introductions, the formal introductions to them will be made by our moderator, who I will be simply introducing to you in a moment. But before we kick off, I just want to say a couple of quick housekeeping notes. The first is that we here at the Middle East Center are a Title VI federally funded national resource center funded through the US Department of Education. As such, those of you who have come to Middle East Center events in the past know that we very much value your opinions. Not only do we value them, but we require them. We do a lot of reporting to the federal government, to our chief sponsors. And so on that note, I am dropping in the chat for you right now a link to a survey, which I would be very, very grateful if everyone can fill sometime before you leave the room today. I understand that sometimes you're not able to stay for the entire event. I hope you do, but if for some reason you're not able to, we would just ask you to take a moment to fill in the survey before you leave, as these opinions are very important to us and to the work that we do, and they help to make it possible for us to continue presenting events like this. In addition to the fact that we genuinely love to hear from you and love to know how we can make these events better. I also want to apologize to you for the fact that I'm coming to you from this shaky iPhone. We were having some technical problems with my computer, so unfortunately I'm on this iPhone video with you. But the good news is you won't have to listen to me for very long, which is always good news, but especially today because you don't have to listen to me on my iPhone for very long. So without any further ado, I want to introduce to you our moderator for this evening's festivities, Dr. Zainab Saleh, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at Haverford College. She works on subjectivity, nostalgia, belonging, war, empire, citizenship, laws, and violence in Iraq and the Iraqi diaspora. She is the author of Return to Ruin, Iraqi Narratives of Exile and Nostalgia, which came out very recently from Stanford University Press. And we had the honor and privilege of hosting her here for a book talk as well, just a few weeks ago in person. She's currently working on a book project titled Uprooted Memories, Citizenship, Denaturalization, and Deportation in Iraq, which focuses on the deportation of Iraqi Jews, Iraqis of Iranian origin, and communists throughout the 20th century. She is a fantastic and just super interesting anthropologist that I always enjoy listening to. But today she's going to be moderating the conversation with Sinan Antoon and Sima Shakhsari. And so with that, I will hand it over to Zainab. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for this wonderful introduction. So I'm going to introduce Sima and Sinan, and I'll start with Sima. Sima Shakhsari is an associate professor in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota. They hold a PhD in cultural and social anthropology from Stanford University and have held postdoctoral positions at the University of Pennsylvania's Wolf Humanities Center and the Women's and Gender Studies Department at the University of Houston. Shakhsari's articles appear in several journals and books, including the International Journal of Middle East Studies, Sexualities Journal, Feminist Review, Arab Studies Journal, Queer Necropolitics, and the transgender studies reader. Their book, titled Politics of Rightful Killing, Civil Society, Gender and Sexuality in Wabalochistan, was published by Duke University Press in 2022, which provides an analysis of Wabalochistan as a site of cyber governmentality where simultaneously national and neoliberal gender subjectivities are reproduced through online and offline heteronormative disciplining and normalizing techniques, and where Iranian life is subjected to a pending death in the name of rights. Shakhsari is currently working on their second book manuscript, tentatively titled Moving Queers and the Queer Moves, Deterritorialization and Lone Life. Our next speaker would be Sinan Antoon, who is an Iraqi-born poet, novelist, scholar, and translator. He has published 2 collections of poetry and 4 novels. His most recent work is the Book of Collateral Damage. His translations include In the Presence of Absence by Mahmoud Darwish, which won the American Literary Translators Association Prize, and Saadi Youssef's Nostalgia, My Enemy. His scholarly works include The Poetics of the Obscene, Ibn al-Hajjaj and Sukhuf, and articles on poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, Sargon Boulos, and Saadi Youssef. He has published co-eds in New York Times, The Washington Post, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and various Arab newspapers and outlets. He is co-founder and co-editor of Jadaliya and associate professor at New York University. So our 2 speakers today will be talking about citizenship. And citizenship has emerged as a site of governmentality and struggle over the parameters of inclusion and exclusion in Iraq and Iran throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The debates on citizenship and belonging have been embedded in national discourses and the practices of state formation, imperial interventions, geopolitical calculations, and popular mobilizations to reconfigure boundaries and belonging. The disparity between ideologies of citizenship and their daily operation are tied to the construction of racial, ethnic, class, political, and religious differences within the state and civil society. Our speaker will address the ways citizenship has been articulated, rearticulated, and disarticulated in the nexuses of power and empire, mobility and diaspora, political activism, class and gender, and media and technologies. And I would like to thank our speakers, and we'll start with Sinan.
Thank you so much, Zainab. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank the organizers, Jeff and John, and it's an honor to be here with Sima. I will, considering the time frame, I will just give some brief remarks and look forward more to the discussion. I'm not a disclaimer, I'm not an expert. I feel that Zainab should have been the speaker because her work is excellent on this issue. But I will begin in a way with the present or the near past and go back in my comments on Iraq, my brief comments. In the October uprising of 2019, the main slogan was, "We want a homeland," indeed, Watan. That was in a way the all-encompassing demand of the tens of thousands of young Iraqi men and women who protested against the corrupt post-2003 regime. And homeland, Watan, muwatana, citizenship, derives from the same root, waw, ta, nun. And in recent years, one demand or category that has gained currency in Iraq amongst opposition figures and others is the demand for citizenship in a way to counter the sectarian, institutionalized sectarianism and the sectarian discourse of the post-2003 regime. This political sectarianism, by the way, is not, I'm afraid I have to repeat, not hundreds of years old and not transhistorical as so many supposed pundits and experts would tell us, but it has its roots in the last 100 years from the founding of the nation state of Iraq. But ironically, of course, this category of citizenship, as Zainab so eloquently mentioned in her introduction, its history is quite problematic and a paradox. So I'll just say a few things about its limitations. And as I was preparing for this, I was thinking of citizenship as, in terms of metaphor, as if it's a straight thought of as a straight universal path to equality for those who acquire it in a given society, and that it can gradually and eventually be expanded and improved to become more inclusive, allowing others of all sorts the chance to be and to use the space towards full citizenship and its perceived and desired benefits. I mean, it just occurred to me that in this country, it's called the path to citizenship, right? But one could argue that it has always been a two-way street, sending many in the opposite direction, or keeping them away at bay, or worse yet, by and large, a one-way street that was never designed to be fully accessible to all. And there are always special lanes, signs, and blocks and checkpoints policing a hierarchy and reproducing marginalization. As citizenship does not operate or exist alone in a vacuum, but it is always implicated in conditions of exclusion and practices of subordination. Hierarchies that are based, as was mentioned by Zainab, on gender, class, race, ethnicity, or religious affiliation. And it is always embedded in and influenced by networks of power, geopolitical rivalries, and implicated in forms of violence, material and discursive. So I'll briefly just look at how this has played out in Iraq since the advent of the modern nation state almost a century ago. And I guess you can tell that I, in a way, started out indirectly with my conclusion, which is that, which I assume the reason behind having this theme is that one should scrutinize and problematize citizenship as a category and be very vigilant and critical. And we have to somehow imagine and construct new forms of belonging. One point to start, of course, is the Iraq before colonialism, before British occupation. And the interesting fact is that all of Iraq's inhabitants were either citizens of, or either Ottoman or Persian citizens. And the rivalry between those two forces and the laws that were enacted will have major consequences for notions of belonging and citizenship, and enduring, in a way, congenital problems in Iraqi nationality laws. Briefly, I mean, the fear of the growing power of certain Shi'i ulama caused the Ottomans to institute laws that would curb the growth of the Shi'i population, and so on and so forth. And of course, this we can talk about later. Gender and who can bequeath citizenship is always an important issue, not only in Iraq, but everywhere almost, and specifically in other countries in the region. And in a way, when British occupation takes place, a lot of the problems and the discrimination carries over to the founding of the nation state in Iraq, so that the first law number 42 in 1924 actually undermines notions of equal citizenship, because it categorized Iraqi citizens on the basis of the citizenship that they held under Ottoman rule. And perhaps one ironic example, of course, which is the irony of a lot of post-colonial nations, is that, of course, the first king of Iraq, King Faisal himself, was not Iraqi, he was from Hijaz. And the law, the nationality law that was written in such a way to confer citizenship and nationality on him. And there are other examples later in how the composition, of course, of the ruling elite of Iraq, most of whom had been Ottoman citizens and had tendencies towards Arab nationalism, would play into the way the Iraqi state would institute laws and would use the category of citizenship for differentiation and discrimination inside the country. There is also the notorious Clash between Sata al-Husri, who was an Arab nationalist of Syrian origin who came to Iraq after with the Ottoman officials who became the members of the elite, and his clash with, Iraq's most important poet in the modern period, al-Jawahiri, who was accused of being an Iranian, and so on and so forth. Moving on, I mean, one of the most important and painful moments, perhaps, in Iraq's history and in the collective memory of Iraqis is how, as I mentioned in a way in the beginning briefly, how citizenship is a two-way street, and that the infamous stripping Iraqi Jews of their citizenship in 1950 and 1951, and how the rising tensions, the establishment of Israel, the rise of Zionism, and the effects of the Nakba and the collusion of the Iraqi regime at the time ended up sending, I mean, ostensibly it was allowing Iraqi Jews to leave the country on the condition that they would relinquish their citizenship. And of course, perhaps many of you know that upon arrival in Palestine, in Israel, they also were subjected to all kinds of discrimination because of their origin. In 1957, we have another infamous decree number 17, which was a law that allowed the state to denaturalize political dissidents and was used against communists primarily and others. And then when we come to the Ba'athist era, we have perhaps the era is crowded with these incidents of deportation and denaturalization. Beginning in the 1970s, of course, because of the regime's ideological leanings, but also its paranoia in terms of political threats that were on the rise in the 1970s, because of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and because of the rise of Shia movements and parties in Iraq. So we have the deportation of thousands of Iraqis, of Kurdish Failis. And then after violence carried out by a number of Shia parties against members of the regime, there was a resolution number 666 in 1980 that dictated the designation of taba'iyya, of those whose ancestors had Iranian citizenship, because of course before the establishment of the Iraqi state, everyone had to be either an Iranian or an Ottoman citizen, were accused of being disloyal and were deported into Iran. Now, this, I mean, maybe later, as an Iraqi, not to be anecdotal, but this was something that many of us witnessed, that overnight, some of our neighbors and some of our friends all of a sudden became foreigners and were deported. Now, coming to 2003 and the post-2003 regime, the ethno-sectarian paradigm that was imposed by the United States. Of course, the subject of political sectarianism is very complicated, and I'm not one to suggest that it only started in 2003, but there is no doubt that in 2003, with the dismantling of the Iraqi state and the rewiring in a way, there was an institutionalization of sectarianism as a political category with major consequences. So it's just a reminder and an example of how other categories override and overpower the supposedly theoretical notions of equality under citizenship. And of course, with the problems that occurred in Iraq, and for example, the rise of ISIS because of the occupation and the war that was carried out in Iraq, now we end up with a host of problems in terms of citizenship and statelessness, actually, because thousands of Iraqis were displaced by ISIS. And then because of the composition of ISIS, including a lot of foreign fighters, so we have a lot of, we have the dilemma of the children of ISIS fighters and the wives of ISIS fighters and so on and so forth, which are of course not being dealt with by the Iraqi regime in a very good way. There's a problem of documentation and the stigma and so on and so forth. There's also a large number of Syrian refugees in Iraq, almost 240,000. And we also have a small number of Bedouin who had come to Iraq from Kuwait after the 1991 Gulf War, stateless, in addition to the Roma, of course. I just wanted to read a short segment in one of my novels in which a young Iraqi teenager, his friend tells him that we are leaving tomorrow because we have been designated as Tabaiya, meaning of Iranian origin, which is based on an actual event that, one of my own friends. So we're leaving tomorrow and I can't take it with me. He's saying he's giving him a gift, which is a stamp album. Why are you leaving? The government is going to deport us. Where to? I don't know, maybe Iran. Why? They say it's about Tabaiya. And what does that mean, Tabaiya? It means we have Iranian origins, Wissam said with derision. But are you really Iranian? No, but my grandfather had an Iranian passport. Qais did not understand what Tabaiya exactly meant. And at the time, he couldn't grasp how Wissam could become a foreigner overnight. He felt sad because Wissam's departure meant they wouldn't walk to school together and he would have to come home alone after school. I will stop here and we can discuss some of these issues later in the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Sinan. Thank you for the wonderful remarks. Sima?
Thank you. Good afternoon or good evening. Thank you so much, Zainab, for the invitation, and Middle East Center and the Andrea Mitchell Center at UPenn, and also Saad, who I know was a part of the organizing team. It's an honor to be on a panel with Sinan and Zainab. Thank you also to the organizers, Jeff, Matt, John, and everyone who has been a part of this. Thank you, Sinan, for that fascinating talk. I learned a lot. And how I'm gonna continue this conversation is to shift gears a little bit and think about citizenship in cyberspace, the rise of netizens or citizens on the internet, which was and perhaps still is very much celebrated, in particular in the first decade of the new millennium. Weblogistan in the context of Iran emerged and got a lot of attention, and it was hailed by Abbas Maroufi, who is a famous Iranian writer, as the turquoise revolution. So before the Arab Spring and this whole wave of Twitter revolution and Facebook revolution were seen as the kind of igniting force behind the social movements in the Middle East. Weblogistan, or the blogging revolution, had become kind of the the form of or had been seen as kind of where dissent happens, and where Iranians who were assumed to have no rights or no voice prior to the emergence of Weblogistan were seen as having a voice. So in the early 2000s, in 2004, 2005 in particular, there was a lot of hype around how blogging is going to set Iranians free, and blogging gives Iranian women a voice, and it was of course a very gendered kind of narrative as well. So I became interested in Weblogistan at that time, and it was actually because of the kind of 2003, when there were student protests in Iran, the satellite television programs that were produced in Los Angeles and broadcast to Iran, all of a sudden, there was this kind of a lot of tension and this heated kind of conversations that were happening on these programs by anchors who all of a sudden, from having entertainment programs, had all become commentators on politics in Iran. And so I became curious about that. And of course, they were very much, the language that was used was very masculinist. I remember this person called from Tehran, and the anchor started by praising them by saying, "Let me sacrifice myself for your manhood." So I was very much fascinated with this and started to actually, this is around 2003, so 18 years ago, I was a grad student. I went to Turkey to talk to Iranians who go back and forth between Iran and Turkey to talk to them about these satellite television programs. And this young woman told me, no one watches these programs. There's tahqiq nadaran, tahrim daran. They don't need to be researched, they need to be boycotted. And she told me to look at blogs, and this was around the same time that the hype in international, in English language media was happening around Persian blogging. There were around 100,000 blogs, Persian blogs. And of course, not all of them were political blogs, but I became interested and started reading these blogs, lurked for a year or so, and then became a blogger myself, and then did some offline ethnography and did some ethnography in Toronto, because unlike these narratives that said blogs are setting Iranian people free, the most influential in the language of Instagram would be kind of influencers. The most significant bloggers lived outside of Iran, the ones that were really popular. Actually, Abul Blogger, or the godfather of Persian blogging, Khoder or Hossein Darakhshan, lived in Toronto at the time. So there were all these bloggers writing about how blogs are going to free Iran, and how blogs were hailed as the side of civil society. The assumption was that there was no civil society in Iran before, and Weblogistan all of a sudden was where civil society had flourished. So I, in my book, as Zainab knows because she has read it and reviewed it, I argue that, of course, Weblogistan is an important site of transnational Iranian civil society. There's no doubt about that. But it's not the first, and it's not the only site. As a matter of fact, I argue that it is exactly because of the conversations that were happening in different public spaces in Iran, because of the existence of vibrant civil society in Iran, that the conversations in Weblogistan become possible. So part of the argument is to kind of burst that cyber enthusiastic bubble about blogs kind of being the side of civil society. And I argue exactly because Weblogistan is a site of civil society, it is a part and parcel of governmentality, what I call cyber governmentality. So rather than the Habermasian way of thinking about state, civil society, citizens, I think about civil society more in a Foucauldian way, that is a part of the government of the population. So basically, rather than kind of this obsession with the state as the entity that has monopoly over violence, I look at Weblogistan, at the conversations that happen, and show the violent exclusions that are very much gendered, very much race, and very much class that happen among the bloggers who write about the future of a democratic Iran. So that is part of the argument that I make. And I want to go back to what I said about the 2003 protests that were covered by the satellite television programs. I learned later that the reason these satellite television programs were really backstabbing too, I went to LA to do some field work in the beginning, was that during Bush's presidency, this is during the so-called beginning of the so-called war on terror, Condoleezza Rice had promised $75 million for democratization projects in Iran. That was through the internet, mainly websites, internet, television, and NGOs. At the end of the day, the money didn't go to any of these television programs in Los Angeles that were run by Iranian diaspora. It was spent on making the television, the Voice of America television. Voice of America in Persian in the past was a radio, of course, you all know, is a propaganda wing of the US that is in several languages, but they started a television program, Voice of America in Persian. But this kind of funding continued. During Obama administration, it was called NERD, the nearest regional democracy funding. No offense to any nerds here. I consider myself to be a nerd, but so the funding was, at different times, different amounts. 2008, it was 25 million for basically internet democratization projects in Iran. And I basically argue that the reason for this popularization of blogging was, in a sense, partially, due to the kind of what I call neoliberal entrepreneurship, that a particular group of bloggers used the opportunity that was that emerged during the so-called war on terror to tap into the funding and to kind of consider themselves to be experts on Iran. So there was a lot of expertise that was produced. And of course, because of the internet democratization projects, blogging at that point was very much the center of attention. So I basically think about how it is through these kind of forms forms that happen, and online and offline interactions among bloggers, that there is this kind of project of so-called liberating Iran. So it's the kind of soft power that was happening. And of course, this is not just about Iran. I mean, in Iraq too, there was Spirit of America, the kind of internet democratization projects that were happening. In the case of Iran, so much money was spent on these kind of democratization projects as well. And stop me when I go over time, Zainab. How much time do I have? I can talk forever, of course, but
you have another 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Basically, the title of the book is The Politics of Rightful Killing. So what I mean by that is that on one hand, you have the US Department of State, the Dutch government, being very interested in democratization projects in Iran. So on one hand, of course, when I talk about governmentality, if we think about governmentality, like I said, in a Foucauldian sense, he talks about how power works on the body of the individual, but, and of course, governmentality is a nexus of individuals, discourses, practices, institutions that enable this kind of power, biopower, that work on the body of the individual, but have as its goal the population, the normalization of population. So what I argue is that there is, through coming together of nationalist discourses on one hand, because there were a lot of, there was a proliferation of nationalist discourses in webloggers among bloggers who were writing about the politics of so-called homeland on one hand, and then you have discourses of democratization from the other end, and it is at the kind of intersection of these discourses that a particular form of Iranianness is produced that kind of is the ideal form of Iranian, if you will, Iranian citizen for the future of a democratic Iran. And that kind of Iranianness, like I said, is kind of a very normative form of Iranianness. And I talk about the discussions around sexuality and how heteronormativity is very much the core of imagination of this kind of Iranianness, and later homonormativity. So, because at that point, it was whoever can kind of imagine the most democratic future for Iran might get the most money or be eligible for this kind of funding, that all of a sudden everyone and their brothers became gay rights advocates of webloggers. I mean, the most homophobic people all of a sudden became, started writing about the rights of homosexuals. And of course, it was the normative kind of sexuality or homosexuality that was to be tolerated, because weblogism was seen as a site of practicing democracy. So people were practicing democracy, and part of that was tolerating homosexuals. The rightful killing, to go back to what I was saying, is that on one hand, you have the Iranian population that is seen as apt for democratization. So it's not a population, let's say, like, Palestinians, that is stripped of rights in the language, in the words of, say, Achille Mbembe. It's not the population that is stripped of rights, or bare life, as Agamben would say. Nor is it the population whose life is worth cultivating and protecting, in Foucault's words, to make, live, and let die. But I think about the Iranian population as that population that on one hand is produced through the discourse of rights, right? From McCain to, I don't know, even Trump, these kind of narratives of protecting the rights of Iranians become one side of the story, at the same time that the Iranian population is subjected to the most deadly sanctions. And this is not, of course, new to Iraqis, but in the case of Iran now, we see that the deadliest sanctions, in particular in Obama's time, started, and then of course we had JCPOA, and then Trump reinstated those, and those sanctions are still in place under Biden. Sanctions that, just like Iraq, inhibit the access to medicine, to life-saving medicine, and so on and so forth. So that is the kind of politics of, right. When I say politics of rightful killing, I'm talking about how while this kind of ideal Iranianness is produced through biopolitics and ethical politics, because Iranians inherently pose a risk to the so-called international community, their lives are also disposable, and they become killable under what I call the politics of rightful killing. So I'll stop here, and then maybe we can continue this in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sima. So I have individual questions, but a question came that is addressed to both of you. So I'm going to start with that, and then we can go to individual questions. One attendee is asking, how did social media influence Iraqi and Iranian citizens' perception of US citizens during the war and terror, and vice versa?
I mean, if I may, I think this is a huge question. But the interesting thing to know and to remember is the effect of the discourse of the war on terror globally, and how various regimes, democratic and undemocratic, appropriated and used this discourse internally to extend their control and power, and to punish citizens. So, and I mean, after 2003, American propaganda was very present in Iraq through something called Al-Hurra, which is a propaganda outlet funded by the US government. There was Al-Hurra Iraq, specifically a TV station, which was very influential inside Iraq, of course, under the guise of being liberal and secular, as opposed to all of the other satellite stations that were owned by all the more sectarian or ethno-sectarian parties. So that discourse infiltrated so many Iraqis, and it had major consequences because any type of opposition to the American-sponsored Iraqi regime was considered terrorism. If there is any opposition to the state in the so-called Sunni areas, which is a very problematic designation, they were considered terrorists and were punished and heavily and dealt with very violently, and it continues, which was one of the tributaries to the rise of ISIS. Whereas, of course, sadly, protests in the central and southern Iraq, of course, they were crushed also violently, but they were not seen as terrorism. And I should say that, so perceptions of US citizens, I don't know, but recently something also very important to go in line with what Sima was saying, in that with the outbreak of the Iraqi uprising, US Al-Hurra still plays a very, to my mind, in my opinion and the opinion of many Iraqis, a very detrimental and negative role in shaping discourses and debates on social media, because of course it's only interested in the US versus Iran geopolitical tension. And so the discourse around the Iraqi uprising, which started out as a rejection of sectarian discourse and a demand for rights, economic and political rights, and a reimagining of a non-sectarian Iraq along patriotic lines, because of the influence of these US-funded propaganda and a lot of Iraqi Americans who work with them, and because of Trump's decision to assassinate Soleimani in Iraq, the discourse has shifted around that to go in line with the war on terror in a way. So, I mean, I guess the short answer is it's very negative perception. I did not answer the question because I think it would take a lot of research to answer your question about how the perceptions changed of US citizens. But I should say, I shouldn't be surprised of the amnesia, because I think amnesia is just part of the way we live, in that, sadly, of course, even though much of the Iraqi catastrophe is because of Iraqis buying into the American discourse that the US will come and intervene and somehow deliver Iraqis to a better future. During the Trump era, because of all of this propaganda and because of all of the despair and because of the violence of Iranian supported militias in Iraq, we went back to that discourse where a lot of Iraqis, or not a lot of Iraqis, significant number of Iraqis somehow bought into the notion that Trump is going to save Iraq and Iraqis from Iranian militias. Sorry for the long answer. Venting.
Sima, would you like to comment?
Sure. I think Sinan is correct in saying that is, almost an impossible question to respond to, because of course it depends on which Iranian you speak to, or which Iraqi you speak to, and again, I haven't done research among Iranians in Iran to say how social media has changed the perception of US citizens for Iranians. I think, again, it depends on who you speak to. But I can say this, and Interpol Grewal's book, I think, Saving the Security State, it makes a good argument about that, and which is that the kind of American exceptionalism and this vision of the US as this kind of superpower and exceptional kind of power kind of crumbled, in particular, during Katrina, and the way that the response of the states to Katrina or COVID, you can argue, has kind of shifted perhaps that image of the kind of invincible image of the US, perhaps worldwide. And, you know, I think I was in my talk yesterday as Ron, I was talking about queer states, and I was talking about how, you know, we can consider, if we use queer theory's notion of failure as a queer art, we can think about how the states that are hailed as failed states can be considered queer states because, you know, they kind of stay out of this notion of international community or the normative notions of rights. And someone asked a question and said, well, you know, the US really has failed to failed its citizens. And I think that is very much correct. We have seen over and over with the response to crises that the image of America as the land of opportunity has kind of been fractured in many senses. So this is kind of going on tangents, but I think what, unfortunately, what Sinan was saying in the case of Iraq, I would say exactly because of the pressure of the sanctions, and this is exactly what happened in Iraq, and you know, your book, Zainab, also talks about this, exactly because of the pressure of the sanctions, and because people are so exasperated and so under pressure that during, you know, many Iranians you would talk to would say, you know, Trump should become president because then at least we'll, you know, we'll be out of our misery, we'll be put out of our misery. And that is exactly what the sanctions mean to do, right? To create dissent, to create so much discontent that for people, it doesn't matter whether it's a US war or not, you know, as we saw in Iraq, that is not quite the case. The devastating effects of you know, military attack are just, you know, are horrible. But when people live in a situation where there is no access to vaccine, there's minimal access to medicine, and you know, the environmental effects of the sanctions, people are tired, and that is, you know, that is perhaps why what Sinan was saying applies to Iran to a certain extent too, that people kind of, exactly because of the US propaganda through many of these programs and diasporic opposition organizations that get funding and consider themselves to be experts on Iran, that unfortunately, you know, that the kind of idea that Trump or the US military intervention might free Iran is something that you could see, not among all Iranians, of course, but you could see in social media quite a bit.
Great, thank you very much, both of you. I'm going to go to individual questions, and I'm going to start with you, Sima, and I really want to bring this question or this comment that is mentioned, because I really, it's about the sanctions, and I think this issue needs to be addressed. So the attendee is asking, that's a shame to blame the problems to sanctions without mentioning the corruption and mismanagement of the Iranian regime. Sanctions are not imposed on medicine, and this language is exactly the language of Iranian regime to justify its action. And I think this is really extremely important to address, because it was the same thing that was said about Iraq, that the sanctions are not detrimental, it's Saddam Hussein to blame. So this is why I'm bringing this, this question. And then another question for you, Sima. Are you hopeful for Iranian Wabalujistan as a mode of expression of discontent?
Thank you, Zainab. Well, I think, the person who asked that question should read your book and also Sinan's work and Nadia Ali's work, of course. But I want to clarify that when I say that the sanctions are killing Iranians, that I'm not exonerating the Iranian state. First of all, we have to be very careful when we use the word regime, because regime kind of flattens all difference, assumes the state to be a monolithic entity that works in a top-down manner. And we give that kind of complexity to the state in the US. Why are we not giving that to the state in Iran or Iraq, for example? So I'm not exonerating the Iranian state. Of course, there are elements, corrupt elements, as they were in Iraq, sanctioned profiteers who are definitely benefiting from the sanctions on the Iranian people. And at the same time, some of the most vocal contestations to this form of corruption are coming from some elements of the state, from the Congress. You have in the parliament, you have members of the parliament who are having passionate fights over these forms of corruption. So we need to be more nuanced in our analysis than regime versus the people. And I also want to clarify that when I say access to medicine is impossible, my nieces are doctors, and I'm saying this not from just thin air. This is based on the actual experience of the Iranian people and medical establishment. Yes, there are certain number of, there is a certain amount of medicine that on paper can be sold to Iran. But the fact of the matter is that these pharmaceutical companies have to go through financial institutions that have to process the transactions. And exactly because of the US sanctions, because of the fear of being penalized, they do not sell medicine to Iran. So that is why we have a crisis. That is why, and it's not just medicine, it's also the equipment. I know that my nieces were complaining about how with the machines that they have to basically, because there are not enough ventilators for COVID patients, they're supposed to be, the tubes are supposed to be disposable ones, but in Iran, they have to disinfect them and use them again, exactly because of lack of access. And the machines, because they have been using them so much, when they basically break down, there's no way to buy those machines exactly because of the sanctions. So this is not, I'm not saying this just, this is, you can read, there are studies that have been done on the effects of sanctions on the Iranian people, and you can look that up and see how sanctions are having not only effects because of the lack of access to medicine, but because Iran, for example, one of the things that I write in my book, and this is based on the research that has been done, is that exactly because the Iranian state under Obama could not basically import petroleum. Iran is an oil producing company, but believe it or not, Iran imports petroleum. They had to start their own kind of domestic or homemade refinery centers. And because of lack of access to all those equipment, the petrol that was refined in Iran contains up to 800 more carcinogenic toxins than the international standard. So Iranian people, by breathing that air, are also dying. The rate of cancer in Iran has increased. So I'll stop because I know Sinan probably has a lot to say about this too. But 2 points: I'm not exonerating the Iranian state, and second, that I cannot believe that someone would say medicine is exempt from the sanctions. The reality of the fact is that there is no access or minimal access to medicine in Iran, to life-saving medicine.
Thank you, Sima. I have a question for you, Sinan, from one attendee. Can Sinan say more about the alternative forms of belonging besides citizenship? And number two, are the problems that Sinan is diagnosing fundamental to the idea of citizenship as such, or rather do they flow from the fact that citizenship tends to be bounded within territorial borders and other forms of particularization? In other words, is the notion of citizenship or instead the fact of political boundaries, borders, that is the root of the problematics he's exposing?
I mean, in my very brief remarks in the beginning, I said that perhaps this is too idealistic, but we have to reimagine citizenship. A lot of these problems are actually applicable to any country in the world, this country that we're living in. You know, I don't need to tell you how the ideal of citizenship and inclusion and rights translates into everyday life. But I just want to go back to something very important about the sanctions, because of the resilience of this myth that somehow, you know, sanctions or what they do. It's unacceptable after all these years. I mean, if you don't believe us, go and read Joy Gordon's amazing book, Invisible War, and the title says it all. But I just want to say that in 1990, when Saddam Hussein's regime invaded Kuwait, the US imposed sanctions because supposedly the sanctions are going to force the Iraqi regime to withdraw from Kuwait. Realizing that the sanctions are not going to force Saddam Hussein and the government to do XYZ, there was a war and Iraq was bombed to the pre-industrial age, yet the sanctions were kept in place. Yes, no one argues, we don't dispute the fact that regimes are corrupt. Yes, but we cannot control the actions of those regimes. But actually, being citizens in this country, we can control the actions of these governments. And if you look at the sanctions, at least I know more about Iraq, but I'm sure it's the same in Iran, they end up actually emboldening the regime. The regime's network actually benefit. This is what happened in Iraq. The ruling elite, they got much richer. And it actually, I mean, also the ridiculous notion that a drained, tired citizenry that is deprived of medicine and food, that has to toil more so than what it toiled, is going to have the energy to topple a regime. It is insulting to intelligence. And I must say that, I mean, all of us, all three of us, I think, have relatives in Iraq whose lives were destroyed by these sanctions. And I still remember, sadly, in the 90s in the US, when we were trying to organize to lift the sanctions, this would always come up. Well, oh, Saddam is building palaces. Yes, of course he's building palaces, but that doesn't mean that people are dying because of the lack of medicine. When we went to Baghdad in 2003 to film a documentary, an Iraqi woman told me something that I will never forget. And this goes back to perceptions of US citizens. She said, I will forgive the Americans for the bombing, but I will never forgive them for the sanctions. She said, because in the bombing, the raid goes for half an hour, I can hide in the basement, I can hide under the stairs, but when I can't get baby formula for my kid, when I can't get medicine, what do I do? So it is an invisible war. And, you know, I mean, aside from sanctions against South Africa, and that's a completely different context, these sanctions never really work. They always end up helping the regime and weakening average citizens. And once again, how ridiculous it is that a citizenry that is deprived of medicine and food is going to muster the energy and organize to topple a regime. How is that possible? But the questions that you posed, I mean, it's very complicated. I mean, I refer you to Zainab's articles and other articles that trace the history of the relationship between nationality and citizenship. And yes, of course, oftentimes it's bounded to territory and so on and so forth. But again, it's a very problematic category. And, you know, that's why we have to keep deconstructing it. We have to keep thinking of other ways to imagine belonging and access to rights anywhere.
Sima, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to reiterate what Sinan was saying in terms of South Africa, the difference between the sanctions with South Africa or the call for divestment and boycott of Israel by the Palestinian civil society is that is when the people, the citizens of South Africa or Palestine are asking the world to boycott because of the racist policies, because of apartheid. Here, this is different. This is a sanction that is imposed by the US, by a superpower, as a form of supposedly punishing and disciplining the regimes that are seen as violators of rights of their citizens. And this is, you know, this kind of punishment is actually hurting ordinary people more than anybody else. As Sinan said, it's not hurting the state, it's not hurting the elites, it's really hurting the people, in particular, the most vulnerable people who don't have access to resources.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought this was an important issue to discuss. So I have a question for the two of you. Are there differences in Iraqi and Iranian youth versus older generation in the discourse of racial, ethnic, religious differences, as well as gender and sexuality?
Sorry, differences between Iran and Iraq, or?
No, the question is about the differences between the youth and the older generation in Iraq and in Iran.
Should I go for it?
Sure, if you want, if you'd like to, Sima, yeah.
Sure. Obviously, you know, just like anywhere else, in Iran and Iraq, too, notions of race and gender and sexuality are dynamic and change. And of course, if you ask about someone who is 80 years old and someone who is 18 years old, their ideas of sexuality and gender are quite different. So it's not that gender and sexuality or notions of race stay static, they change. And I would say, yes, it makes sense that there are differences in all of these kind of formations and these discourses that exist on these. But there are also certain continuities that repeat themselves through perhaps nationalist discourses, and those maybe in different ways repeat the same ideals of the nuclear family. And that is something that I discuss in my book, the difference between, you know, the generation of so-called exiles and then the Iranian diaspora. Of course, there are differences, but then there are certain nationalistic discourses that reiterate themselves exactly because how nationalism works, right? There's this kind of glorification of an immemorial past, and the ideas of reproducing the nation, and all of those kind of rely on heteronormativity. But, you know, in more recent years, we also see how queers participate in these forms of nationalism. So homonormative ideas of nation are also producing, where nation basically kind of absorbs or includes those who have been previously excluded. And we see that, again, Iran and Iraq are not an exception. We see that in Iran too, after the so-called war on terror. We saw how exactly because of the needs of the war, gays in the military, you know, there was a don't ask, don't tell situation where, you know, the policies changed, and, you know, then queerness became kind of a yardstick of progress, right? What people have written about, Puar has written about it in the context of homonationalism. So both ideas of nation and also the way that nation articulates gender, ethnicity, race, and sexuality change, but there are also certain, I would say, continuities.
Sina?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this applies to Iraq, but I just wanted to say that, I mean, one of the great things about the uprising is that it, showed that these young Iraqis who had been marginalized institutionally and socially, and as is the case always, older generations dismiss them as being busy playing video games and not really having any sense of positive affiliation or desire for the future, proved that actually, as we saw in a way in the Arab uprising in 2011, I remember it was the same discourse and dismissiveness of that. So the new notions of and new dynamic worldview of so many young Iraqi men and women was on full display in those 3 and 4 months, in their talents, artistically and otherwise, in their creativity. But of course, I mean, unfortunately, they're also hitting the wall of the current Iraqi regime and its pervasive power and the militias that have killed 800 peaceful protesters. But of course, one should always assume that the young generation of any society are quite dynamic and quite changing and so on and so forth. But I should say that maybe this is not what the question wants to hear, but to go back to how memories of conflict and, I didn't speak enough about it, but the kind of the Arab-Persian tension or how Arab nationalism is deployed, ironically and paradoxically, that of course in the 80s, in the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran, the Iraqi regime and the Ba'ath Party portrayed that war not as a war between two dictatorships over territory and geopolitics, but as some kind of Arab-Persian rivalry, drawing back on symbols from Arabo-Islamic history and so on and so forth. And of course, throughout the 80s, the Iraqi state was very powerful and rich, and there was an entire archive of songs and poems that were all about this Arab-Persian rivalry and the Iranians and so on and so forth. Ironically, now in Iraq, because of the power of Iraqi militias that are supported by Iran monetarily and materially, or actually are answerable directly to the Iranian regime, and the kind of power they hold within the Iraqi regime, a lot of the opposition by young and older Iraqis to this current regime is reusing and redeploying songs and poems from the era of dictatorship. And some of them use them knowingly, but many of them don't realize that, part of this song and its vocabulary or the poem fits the, it's repurposed for different, but so a lot of the vocabulary and the anti-Iranian sentiments that were so prevalent in the 80s because of Iraqi nationalism are on the rise again because of the current situation. Just to be true to my pessimism, I started with an optimistic note, but then we have to be pessimistic.
Yes, this is also a question for the two of you. How valuable is citizenship when authoritarian states can oppress their citizens as they will with no repercussions or censure from communities, regional or international? In other words, why would anyone want to be Iraqi, Iranian, Egyptian when their lives could be at risk for simply exercising certain civil rights like protest? Who would like to go first, Sinan or Sima?
Can I just briefly say, sorry, the only answer I have is that citizenship, like other categories we have at our disposal, is itself a site. It has a lot of problems and limitations, but in the absence of another category, people have to work with it and change it as much as possible radically. But I think what we've been saying is that there are all of these other forces and categories that are part of the baggage of citizenship that have to be taken into consideration. So it's a site that we have to work with, whether under a dictatorship or in a democratic society like here. Because, for example, here, citizenship bears the marks of settler colonialism and slavery and so on and so forth. This is a reality that you see by walking down the street. So until we invent a new category and new, better forms, we have to work with citizenship.
I absolutely agree. I was going to start by saying why one wants to be an American citizen when American citizenship is very much imbued with histories and presence of racism, settler colonialism, and many forms of economic violence and imperialism around the world. But this is, I think, as Sinan said, and I think what we both have been trying to reiterate is that state is not the only force that basically, has the monopoly over governance or violence, that we need to think about politics of citizenship in a transnational context. And we need to also think about what does it mean to think about rights, right? So if we think about, Hannah Arendt's notion of the right to have rights constitutes citizenship, we have to also think about, yes, if you, as I say, within the context of politics of rightful killing, even if you're considered to be deserving of rights, if you can become killable exactly through sanctions or wars, then we need to really, as Sinan said, rethink the concept of citizenship and maybe undo it and rethink in more creative ways about working beyond the context of the nation state and thinking about histories of and the presence of militarization, settler colonialism, and imperialism in, as we also think about how the states are taking rights away. I think we also need to also rethink along with that the dichotomies of authoritarianism and liberal democracy, because I think we already assume that liberal democracy is the form of the ideal form of governance, and within that there is an amnesia and erasure of the violences of liberal democracy that, as Sinan said, are in the context of US, for example, very much imbued with histories of slavery and settler colonialism.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Sinan, and then I will come back to a question for you, Sima. So one of the attendees, Sinan, is curious about what you might say about resistance or rejection of Iraqi citizenship. So, for example, the person mentioned puts Kurds between parentheses. So I don't know if you'd like to comment on this.
I mean, I don't know if that is a rejection. Of course, there is a problem in that, in the way the Iraqi nation state and Iraqi nationalism was constructed and imagined and disseminated, which, like all nationalisms, has its own exclusions and its production of the other. So it's not a rejection. I mean, if this is of course a very complicated subject. I personally, like a lot of Iraqis, think that if the majority of the Kurdish population want to have an autonomous or a separate state, that is their right to do that. You cannot, and the country has suffered so much because of this forcible imposition. But on the other hand, we have seen that the Kurdish political elites and the oligarchy there, of course, are only deploying nationalism, Kurdish nationalism, and the memories of the oppression and violence of the Saddam regime to not really build an open, equitable society for so many Kurds. Maybe most of you have been watching the news. The thousands of human beings stranded between Belarus and Poland are actually Kurds from Iraqi Kurdistan. They are fleeing a very rich region because the economic and social situation there is horrible. So I don't know about rejection. I mean, look, if with all of the problems of the state, and of course the need for us to think beyond the state, but it's not that people are rejecting. For folks who never really managed to feel at home in this discourse and never really were given or treated equally by a state and its laws and institutions, we can't call that rejection. It is their right. It is one's right, lawful, understandable right, lawful is not the right word, to reject that. So the issue of competing nationalisms and the Kurdish rights of Kurdish minorities, and I don't want to use the word minorities, but we are also in the prison house of language. I don't call it rejection. People don't have even the luxury to reject. But something completely different but related, I must say, the irony that so many in powerful positions in Iraq have dual citizenship. It's those people who have the luxury of rejecting, most of whom came from abroad and most of whom were actually groomed by the United States and by Britain and Saudi Arabia and Iran and others. That's I'm using the question just to say this because I needed to put it in. That's the irony of Iraq. Also, the irony of Iraq is the current president of the Republic is someone who I think voted for the secession of Kurdistan from Iraq. It just shows you how surreal it is.
Thank you, Sinan. Sima, I have a question for you. Are you hopeful for Iranian Wabalojistan as a mode of expression of discontent? So I think it's just the same theme: resistance, rejection, discontent.
Weblogistan was really at its peak in the first decade of the millennium. So we are kind of in a post-blogging era now. A lot of people are doing Twitter, so it shifted. What I talked about was my research, which was on Weblogistan, that was hailed, like I said, as one of the first internet revolutions, right? The turquoise revolution, as it was hailed. I don't think Weblogistan kind of delivered the kind of promises that, or the kind of hopes that were put on it as freeing Iran and so on and so forth. Like I said, people are tweeting now and all the fights are happening in the Twitter and shorter posts rather than long blogging posts. I am probably worse than Sinan in my pessimism. I actually end my book by a note on pessimism, but it's a pessimism that I see as a possibility of politics. And I say that with a personal experience and personal note, which is, my sister's passing away from cancer. And, until her last days, she continued to translate books or, work with and, translate books for youth and for an environmental kind of justice group. So even though she knew she was dying, and, I do blame the sanctions for also her untimely death, because it was not just not having access and the dilemma of getting chemo for her treatment, but also radiotherapy, and how her radiotherapy was interrupted exactly because of the Stuxnet virus that the US and Israel sent to Iran and shut down all the machines that work with nuclear energy, including radiotherapy machines. and how that devastated her health and ended up, having serious effects on her health. But what I am trying to say on the note with pessimism is that it is exactly, even as one knows that one doesn't have a futurity that is granted to populations whose lives are worth saving, but it's exactly because knowing that there is knowing that there is a possibility of change, that even as one is becoming disposable, one continues to have hope, right? So it's kind of pessimism that is at the same time enabling kind of politics of hope at the same time. And to say that whether it's Weblogistan or any kind of social media that holds that hope, I'm more skeptical about that, because I don't think that, that is kind of, not the 84 million population in Iran doesn't have the same kind of access to internet or the kind of luxury to be tweeting. So I think, while social media kind of gives access, has a widespread among a certain group of Iranians, but I think we need to think beyond that and in more creative ways about how dissent will happen, and how that dissent may not happen through these ideals of internet revolution or revolution from outside, or military attack or regime change, that we need to also think about how change happens in minute ways that comes from within and not from outside.
Great, thank you very much. Another question for the two of you. Do you think there are inherent conflicts between international human rights law and its notion of universal human rights and the global political system of statehood and citizenship, which gives citizens and non-citizens different rights in practice? Furthermore, do you see citizenship as a product of colonialism and imperialism? I would love to hear more about what both of you might envision as a better alternative to the current system. Sinan, would you like to start?
That's the $3 trillion question.
Oh.
No, I mean, in the past, God knows how many decades, there's all of this critique of universalism, because universalism was never universal. The subject of universal discourse was always, oftentimes, of a certain gender and a certain race and so on and so forth. But if there was any moment when we realized that this entire world that we live in, which is the product of global capital and colonial modernity, is not working, we are actually destroying the planet and its species as we speak. So definitely, all of these universalisms, I mean, they have wrecked the world and visited so much violence in the name of universalism, which was a discourse deployed by a certain group, and it was never really universal. So once again, I know it sounds easy to say we should imagine, but I think this is the moment that the world is living now, to redefine our relationship to our being, to our bodies, to others, to the planet itself. And this is where, to me, going back and reading more about indigenous culture and indigenous notions of dealing with one's environment and with others might be quite illuminating as to how to get out of all of this. But definitely, all of these categories are very problematic and very violent, especially, frankly, in our part of the world. So I leave it to Sima to put the icing.
Sima?
I agree with Sinan to a great extent, and I think these ideas of universalism and universal rights have dependent on the notions of human that have been equated with man with capital M, as many scholars like Hortense Spiller and Sylvia Winter and others have argued that the idea of man imbued with rights has been basically the man of colonial modernity, right? And it has excluded others from the realm of humanity and by extension, the right to have rights. So I think we need to be more creative, as Sinan says, and even if we think about the nitty-gritties of international human rights and the universalization of rights, my project and my research and my work is on queer and trans Iranian refugee applicants who are in Turkey, and how it is, the stories that they're leaving Iran because of the homophobia, transphobia of the Iranian state, whereas, as I argue, the number of queer and trans refugees that left Iran in particular increased after 2010, and that was as a direct result of the sanctions, because queer and trans Iranians are in the margins of the Iranian society. They were the ones who were hit, one of the groups that were hit the hardest, the working class queer and trans people, with the sanctions. And if you talk to the UNHCR officers, they will tell you that the number of refugees that started living in Iran increased drastically, exactly because of Obama's tightening of the sanctions, what he called the crippling sanctions on Iran. And that is when also a huge number, Iran is home to more than 3 million Afghan refugees, a huge number of Afghan refugees who had lived in Iran for more than 2 decades started leaving Iran, the second wave of migration, to go to Turkey to apply for refugee status, hoping for a better life. Guess what? Many of them have been stuck in Turkey for over a decade, if not more, exactly because of this backlog, because the UNHCR does not consider economic refugees as refugees. That's not one of the definitions of what constitutes a refugee. So we need to think about this, what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to be a refugee? And also, what does it mean when we talk about refugee rights under the, under the protection of international human rights? It is exactly in the name of protection of rights that refugees in transition are stripped of rights, that they don't have the right to work. They don't basically, they're stuck, if not in camps, they don't have access to economic means. And, this is just one example of how the framework of rights doesn't work, right? It's not sufficient to think through the limited notion of rights, and we need to think beyond that.
Thank you very much. We are, it's almost 6 o'clock. Thank you very much, Sinan and Sima, for this wonderful discussion and conversation. John, would you like to say something, or?
I would like to say a very big thank you to both of our guests, both of our guests and our moderator, all three of our guests, depending on your semantics. I am very grateful to all of you for this fascinating conversation. I hope everyone found it as interesting as we did. I just want to remind you all, I'm dropping once again the link to the survey in the chat for everyone who has joined us. Please, if you can, take a moment to fill that in before you leave. But otherwise, with gratitude to the Andrea Mitchell Center, to Jeff Green, to Matt Roth, to Zainab Saleh for skillful moderation, and to our brilliant guests, Sinan Antoon and Sima Shakhsari. We're very grateful, and grateful to all of you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.